Good morning. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida, where SpaceX is counting down to another launch of a Falcon 9 rocket. This liftoff is scheduled for 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:31 a.m. UTC. That's, as you can see on the countdown clock on the upper right, about 1 hour, 1 minute away from this moment. This mission will be deploying another batch of Starlink internet satellites. This particular mission is designated Starlink 6-3. On board the Falcon 9 this morning are 22 of SpaceX's upgraded Starlink version 2 mini satellites. Despite the name mini, these satellites are in fact much larger and heavier than the Starlink satellites that SpaceX has been launching over the last few years. This is the third launch to carry these upgraded, larger, more powerful satellites to join SpaceX's Starlink internet network. This launch was scheduled for 12:41 a.m. Eastern Time, but has been delayed 50 minutes to wait for weather to clear out of the area around the space launch or spaceport at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. And now liftoff is 1 hour away at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:31 a.m. UTC. Earlier in the evening, there was quite a bit of thunderstorm activity and rainfall at the spaceport. Right now, we're getting reports from Kennedy Space Center looking overhead that the stars are beginning to make an appearance. So that's a great sign of thinning cloud cover over the launch site. This camera view comes from our facility at Kennedy Space Center, about 4 miles away from Slick 40, Space Launch Complex 40, where the Falcon 9 is awaiting launch this morning. It'll take about an hour and 5 minutes for the Falcon 9 to deliver these 22 Starlink internet satellites into their planned orbit. That will require 2 burns by the upper stage of the Falcon 9, while the first stage, the booster, will return to target a landing offshore on one of SpaceX's drone ships. This particular drone ship being targeted for landing tonight is named a Shortfall of Gravitas. It's one of 3 landing platforms in SpaceX's maritime fleet. The Falcon 9 out on pad 40 stands 229 feet or 70 meters in height. The flashing lights you see on either side of the rocket are hazard lights on the lightning protection towers at pad 40. These lightning towers are designed to protect the rocket while it's on the pad from any risk of a lightning strike or a direct hit from lightning. Those lightning towers are designed to attract lightning to them, and then the electrical charge from the lightning is distributed and grounded through a series of wires or catenary wires that connect each of those 4 towers together and on to the ground as well. Liftoff now 58 minutes away. The exact target launch time for those of you who track such things is 1:31 and 40 seconds a.m. Eastern Time. My name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now, and I'll be providing updates throughout the countdown this morning and throughout the initial phase of the Falcon 9's ascent into orbit. It'll take about 8.5 minutes for the Falcon 9 rocket to deliver these 22 satellites to their preliminary orbit. Another burn will come later this morning to set the stage for the deployment of these 22 satellites into orbit about an hour and 5 minutes into the mission. It'll also take about 8.5 minutes for the first stage of the Falcon 9 to complete its suborbital arc. This is a ballistic trajectory downrange before it ends up for landing on the drone ship, a vertical touchdown on 4 landing legs on the drone ship positioned northeast of the Bahamas. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us attract a larger audience for our launch coverage as we get closer to liftoff time. So again, if you haven't done so, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, Right now, the countdown for the Falcon 9 is targeting liftoff at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. That is the second of 4 launch opportunities this morning. The first of those 4 opportunities was at 12:41 a.m. Eastern Time, around this time actually, just a few minutes from now. But SpaceX elected a couple hours ago to forego that launch opportunity due to some stormy weather around the Space Center. Right now, the target is 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. If the weather is a problem or there's any other issue, SpaceX does have 2 additional launch opportunities this morning. Those 2 additional launch opportunities would be at 2:19 a.m. or 3:09 a.m. Eastern Time. So 4 instantaneous opportunities available to launch this mission this morning. Right now, SpaceX is targeting the second of the 4. Here's a look at the satellite picture showing some of the cloud cover over the Florida Peninsula associated with quite a bit of thunderstorm activity earlier this evening. Those thunderstorms are pushing offshore and are dissipating. So the trend weather-wise is favorable for improving conditions throughout the next couple of hours. Here's a closer look at Florida. That circle is around the spaceport at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. See, those clouds are thinning and generally pushing offshore over the course of the last few hours this evening, with the weather continuing to trend in a favorable direction according to SpaceX. And just eyeballing that satellite picture, you can also easily and obviously see the clouds are thinning and moving away from the launch base here on Florida's Space Coast. Now 53 minutes, 20 seconds until liftoff. T-minus 49 minutes and counting until the scheduled launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with 22 upgraded Starlink satellites on board. We're now less than 15 minutes away from the time that we expect SpaceX to start loading propellants into the Falcon 9. That should begin at T-minus 35 minutes. Now 43 minutes from the scheduled launch time of 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 5:31 a.m. UTC. We haven't heard any updates from SpaceX yet on the progress of the countdown since their most recent tweet, which was a couple of hours ago, confirming that the time of the launch would be adjusted or changed from 12:41 a.m. to 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, SpaceX has 2 additional launch opportunities later this morning if the weather or technical issues are a factor. They could target a launch later this morning. Those 2 backup times are at 2:19 a.m. and 3:09 a.m. Eastern Time. We're now about 7 minutes away from the expected time of propellant loading. So at this point in the countdown, SpaceX's launch team should be going through their pre-launch readiness poll. This is an electronic poll for all the engineers on the launch team to register their readiness to proceed into the final 35 minutes of the countdown. At T-minus 35 minutes, SpaceX would begin loading kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants into the Falcon 9 rocket. And also at that time, an automated computer will take control of the countdown for the final checks and propellant loading and all the other verification tasks that have to be completed to make sure the rocket is ready to take to the sky. And then at T-minus 1 minute, the final 60 seconds of the countdown, the onboard computer, the flight computer on the Falcon 9 will take over. And SpaceX has just confirmed they're targeting a new launch time. So scratch the 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time launch time from your minds and reset that for 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time. So we're now about an hour and 28 minutes away from the expected launch time for the Falcon 9 that is now scheduled for 2:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time or 6:19 a.m. UTC. SpaceX says the weather continues to improve as the team targets the 3rd of 4 possible launch opportunities tonight. And we've reset our countdown clock on the upper right to that new launch time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time or 6:19 a.m. UTC. So we'll hope you'll stick with us as we continue streaming live from Kennedy Space Center as SpaceX is now an hour and 27 minutes from launch, or about 50 minutes away from the start of propellant loading when action will really start to pick up with the countdown. It's now 1 a.m. here on Florida Space Coast, 5 a.m. UTC. If you're just joining us and you're hoping to see the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket at 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time, SpaceX is now targeting 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time for liftoff. That is 6:19 a.m. UTC. This is the third of four instantaneous launch opportunities that SpaceX has available this morning. They've already skipped over the first two, which were at 12:41 and 1:31 a.m. Eastern. So 2:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time is the new target launch time for the Falcon 9 rocket and the 22 Starlink internet satellites that are buttoned up inside the payload fairing at the very top of the launch vehicle. This mission is designated Starlink 6-3 in SpaceX's mission sequence. This booster that is flying on this mission is booster 1076. It's launching for the fifth time in its career and will target a landing on one of SpaceX's recovery platforms or drone ships out in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas. The Falcon 9 will take a trajectory toward the southeast on this morning's mission to target injection of these 22 Starlink satellites into an orbit inclined 43 degrees to the equator, a low Earth orbit, roughly 200 miles or 320 kilometers above the Earth. SpaceX has said over the last few hours that the weather situation here on Florida Space Coast is trending in a favorable direction. Conditions are improving after a stormy evening in Central Florida. So we'll see if the weather cooperates for this updated target launch time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, 1 hour, 7 minutes until the new target launch time for SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, which is 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time or 6:19 a.m. UTC. Let's take a look at the different major components of the Falcon 9 as it stands vertical out on pad 40. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is powered by 9 Merlin 1D engines. These Merlin engines each consume kerosene, a rocket-grade kerosene called Rocket Propellant 1 or RP1 as the fuel. The oxidizer is cryogenic liquid oxygen. These 9 engines will generate about 1.7 million pounds of thrust at full power and will burn for about 2.5 minutes before this booster detaches from the upper stage and begins a descent toward a drone ship out in the Atlantic Ocean southeast of Cape Canaveral, a few hundred miles downrange. This particular booster is numbered 1076 in SpaceX's inventory, going for its 5th flight to space. Just above the first stage is the carbon fiber interstage adapter. This black cylinder sits on top of the first stage. It will actually come back to Earth with the booster. It comes back to Earth and is reused between missions as well. And around the circumference of this black interstage adapter are the 4 titanium grid fins. These grid fins are folded up against the body of the launch vehicle during the ascent into space. Once the booster separates to begin its plunge back into the atmosphere, these 4 grid fins will deploy and extend to provide some aerodynamic stability and some steering capability during the descent back through the atmosphere. Coal gas thrusters on the first stage will also provide most of the steering and pointing, but these grid fins are there just for some additional steering authority and control. Inside that interstage adapter, it's a hollow volume. Inside that adapter sits the upper stage engine. The upper stage engine is a derivative of the Merlin engine used on the first stage. So this upper stage engine is called the Merlin vacuum or MVAC engine. It produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust at full power in the vacuum of space. The big difference between this engine and the first stage engines is this engine has a larger nozzle for better performance in the vacuum of space. Those 9 engines on the first stage have smaller engine nozzles optimized for flight through the atmosphere and at sea level. The upper stage is the only major part of the launch vehicle that is not reusable. So it is produced for each mission brand new out at SpaceX's factory in Hawthorne, California. And this particular mission, as with many Starlink missions, this engine will perform a total of 3 burns on this flight. The first burn will place the 22 Starlink internet satellites into a preliminary parking orbit. There will be a second burn to raise that orbit and reshape it to set the stage for separation of those 22 satellites. And then after separation, the engine will relight again briefly for a deorbit burn to maneuver and steer this upper stage back through the atmosphere where it will burn up during reentry. This upper stage will not be left into orbit to ensure that it doesn't create any unnecessary space debris. Above the upper stage on the Falcon 9 as it stands vertical is the payload fairing. This payload fairing is made up of 2 shells, aerodynamic shells. The structure stands about 43 feet or 17 meters tall. It's about 17 feet wide or about 5.2 meters in diameter. And inside these 2 fairing shells sit the 22 Starlink internet satellites. Again, these Starlink satellites going to space this morning are of the upgraded variety, the Starlink version 2 Mini or V2 Mini design. This design, despite the name Mini embedded in it, is actually a much larger, much heavier, more powerful and more capable design than the Starlink satellites that SpaceX has been launching over the last few years. This is the 3rd launch to deploy these upgraded Starlink V2 Mini satellites. So there's a look at the Falcon 9 rocket as it stands vertical on pad 40. Now 1 hour and 2 minutes and 23 seconds from the updated target launch time, which once again, to recap, is 2:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time or 6:19 a.m. UTC. For those of you who have been following the progress of this mission throughout the evening, you'll know that the original time was 12:41 a.m. Eastern for liftoff. That was pushed back to 1:31 a.m. Eastern Time. Now we're talking about 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time. If the weather doesn't cooperate this morning, then the backup launch time, the final opportunity, is at 3:09 a.m. Eastern time this morning. Otherwise, the launch would have to be postponed or delayed till perhaps early Saturday, another 24 hours from now. But SpaceX has said that the weather trend is favorable, so the weather conditions are improving. So we'll stand by for further updates as SpaceX is now a little more than an hour from the target launch time. So we're now approaching the T-minus 1 hour point in the countdown once again this morning. We've already reached this point when SpaceX was targeting the earlier launch time of 1:31 a.m. So now we're an hour away from the updated liftoff time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern time. That is 6:19 a.m. UTC. SpaceX, if the countdown remains on schedule, SpaceX is expected to begin loading propellants in the Falcon 9 rocket at T-minus 35 minutes. That's about 25 minutes from now. While we wait, if you haven't done so already, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us out a lot as we want to attract as many viewers as possible as we hope to see the Falcon 9 fire off the pad and into orbit this morning. Here's another close-up look at the satellite picture over Florida. You see the cloud cover just off the east coast. Some of those clouds were over the spaceport earlier in the evening a few hours ago, but those have pushed offshore. So the weather picture is improving this morning as SpaceX is now about 55.5 minutes from the updated target launch time. Countdown now is 52 minutes away from the target launch time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern, 6:19 a.m. UTC. For those of you just joining us, my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now, and welcome to our live coverage. We had hoped to see the Falcon 9 already off the ground this morning. That was originally set for 12:41 a.m. Eastern time as the target launch time. That was later delayed to 1:31 a.m. Eastern due to some stormy weather, and again has been pushed back to 2:19 a.m. Eastern time. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us gain a larger audience and attract more viewers as we get closer to liftoff time. Also, if you haven't done so, please subscribe. Hit the subscribe button here on our YouTube channel. If you do that, you'll get alerts every time we're going live with launch coverage. So if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe, and you'll never miss another launch event. produced by Spaceflight Now. We're now a little more than 15 minutes away from the next major milestone in this countdown. If everything is going to remain on schedule, that will be at T-minus 35 minutes with the start of propellant loading. Now 46 minutes until SpaceX's target launch time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern, 6:19 a.m. UTC. This mission is numbered Starlink 6-3 in SpaceX's mission sequence. There are 22 Starlink satellites on board. This is the third launch of the Starlink V2 Mini design, following launches back in February and in April. These satellites each weigh about 1,760 pounds or 800 kilograms. Their solar panels unfurled to a wingspan of 100 feet or about 30 meters once in space. These satellites are significantly larger and heavier and more powerful than the previous generation of Starlink version 1.5 satellites that SpaceX has launched now more than 80 times over the course of the last 4 years or so. In fact, the first Starlink launch, the first prototypes, the first full batch of prototypes, I should say, launched back in May of 2019. So 4 years ago this month, and SpaceX has now launched 84 dedicated Starlink missions. Tonight would be number 85. These satellites, you see on the right side of your screen here, a photo from the launch back in February showing what this stack of Starlink V2 mini satellites looks like before encapsulation inside the payload fairing. These spacecraft are powered by solar generated electricity, and have thrusters fueled by argon. These are electric plasma thrusters used for in-orbit maneuvers. SpaceX builds the satellites on an assembly line in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle, and these satellites will be deployed by the Falcon 9 at an altitude of about 200 miles or 320 kilometers above the Earth, with an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. So SpaceX is launching Starlink satellites into a number of different low Earth orbits, all in the range of a few hundred miles in altitude, but their inclinations vary from 43 degrees in the case of this mission all the way up to 97 degrees polar orbit to cover the entire planet. And the constellation is divided into numerous planes with a certain number of satellites in each plane, depending on which inclination they're in. So it's quite a complex system, a complex setup that SpaceX has devised. The end goal, of course, is uninterrupted global broadband coverage, high-speed, low-latency internet to consumers around the world. This particular batch of Starlink satellites will be going into an orbital plane that's been identified for the second generation Starlink network. So SpaceX's first generation network will, when finished, consist of about 4,400 active satellites, and nearly 4,000 of those satellites are currently in operation. So SpaceX is nearing completion of deploying their first generation Starlink network and is already in the early stages of deploying their second generation network. Here's a look of a side-by-side view of the Starlink version 1.5 satellites as they appear stacked for launch on the left-hand side of your screen here. That's from a previous mission. You can see on the right the much larger stack of Starlink V2 mini satellites. So a Falcon 9 rocket can actually launch up to 56 when fully loaded of the Starlink version 1.5 satellites, and only about 22 of the V2 mini satellites. SpaceX is working on an even larger Starlink satellite design called the V2, and the Starlink V2 full-size satellites will be designed to launch on SpaceX's Starship rocket, a much larger rocket designed to carry more than 100 tons of payload into low Earth orbit. Now, 41 minutes away from the current target launch time, which remains 2:19 a.m. Eastern or 6:19 a.m. UTC. The weather has been an issue throughout the night with some storms throughout the evening at Cape Canaveral and around the Central Florida area. And now SpaceX is contending with some concerns with upper level winds. These winds in the upper atmosphere uh, could exceed the safety limit for the Falcon 9's structural integrity and also the steering capability of the Merlin engines to guide the rocket through wind shear, which is upper level wind conditions at different speeds from different directions at different altitudes. So as the Falcon 9 climbs up through the atmosphere, it has to contend with those winds at different altitudes. And depending on the strength of the winds, the speed of the wind, and the direction, and the altitude at which those winds are, there is a very complicated calculation and decision that SpaceX has to make based on the day of launch conditions to whether those conditions would exceed the Falcon 9 rocket's ability to safely steer through those winds. The Space Launch Delta 45, the Space Force's 45th Weather Squadron at Cape Canaveral, periodically sends up weather balloons throughout the countdown before every launch here in Florida. And those weather balloons measure the wind speeds at different altitudes, and that data is then fed to the launch company, in this case SpaceX, for their calculations. Right now, SpaceX's launch team should be going through their pre-launch readiness poll. And we expect to hear a report out from that poll in the next couple of minutes before the start of propellant loading, which is due to begin at T-minus 35 minutes. That's 3 minutes from now.
Repeat for ground stations if necessary.
Poll for propellant load is complete. We are go for propellant load and launch.
SpaceX has just confirmed the poll of the launch team is now complete, and all stations are go for propellant loading and for launch. So SpaceX will proceed into the final 35 minutes of the countdown for a target launch time of 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time, 6:19 a.m. UTC. We're now about a minute away from propellant load beginning.
This is LD briefing the abort instruction. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CU or LD and they will approve aborting the count. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operator shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the auto sequence and proceed into launch abort. At T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands-off, relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Launch auto sequence is started.
SpaceX has now started loading propellants in the Falcon 9 rocket that came at T-minus 35 minutes. You heard the voice of the launch director give a briefing to the launch team on how to handle any holds or any aborts in the final 35-minute automated sequence. And the loading of fuel and oxidizer is now underway on the Falcon 9. This begins with flowing kerosene and liquid oxygen into the two-stage Falcon 9 rocket. So both propellants are flowing into the first stage right now, and on the upper stage, only fuel is being loaded. Liquid oxygen won't start loading into the second stage of the Falcon 9 until about 16 minutes prior to launch. That's still some time away. So 3 of the 4 propellant tanks currently are being filled for liftoff at 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time. That is 6:19 a.m. UTC. This mission will be deploying 22 more Starlink satellites. These are satellites that are upgraded, larger than most of the Starlink satellites that SpaceX has launched to date. So these spacecraft are heavier, and therefore SpaceX can only fit about 22 of these satellites on the Falcon 9 before maxing out the rocket's lift capability. For the smaller, older generation satellites, SpaceX routinely launches more than 50 in one shot. Countdown now, 33 minutes and 13 seconds. Here's a look at the Starlink V2 mini satellites. This is the design that's flying on this mission. This photo comes from a previous launch earlier in the year. These satellites have 4 times the capacity, the communications throughput of SpaceX's previous older generation V1.5 satellites. These version 2 mini spacecraft introduce a new communications frequency, an E-band for backhaul. They also have upgraded phased array antennas. And one change to the spacecraft bus, these upgraded satellites use argon Hall thrusters to replace the krypton-fueled ion thrusters used on the older generation satellites. This comes with an increase in thrust, an improvement in efficiency, and also the argon is a much cheaper fuel to feed these thrusters than krypton. So SpaceX is building thousands and thousands of these satellites, and when you build that many, you start to consider things like fuel cost. And so they've switched to argon. They get out not only the performance increase or performance improvement, but also a cut in the cost, reduction in the cost of the fuel. These satellites come out to about 2.6 times the mass of the older generation satellites. These satellites each weigh about 800 kilograms, or more than 1,700 pounds, and they have 4.4 times the surface area of the previous Starlink satellite design. With these a stack of 22 Starlink V2 mini satellites, this will near or perhaps exceed. We'll see if SpaceX will confirm the mass record, the weight record for a payload by any SpaceX rocket. That record has currently been set on several missions that have carried a full complement of 56 of the older generation satellites. Those 56 satellites on those previous missions earlier this year total about 17.4 metric tons based on the mass number that we have for a single Starlink version 2 mini satellite of 800 kilograms. Multiply that by 22, you get to 17.6 metric tons. So just based on the arithmetic, we think this will set a record for the heaviest payload ever launched on a SpaceX rocket, heavier than the Dragon spacecraft that launches on the Falcon 9 to deliver crew or cargo to the space station, and even heavier than any of the payloads that have launched on the heavier Falcon Heavy rocket. The Falcon Heavy, of course, is 3 Falcon 9 boosters strapped together to haul payloads, heavier payloads, more massive payloads into orbit, or to deliver those payloads into higher energy or higher altitude orbits. The Falcon Heavy to date has largely done the latter, carry up satellites into high altitude orbits, thousands of miles above the Earth. And when you do that, you can't carry as heavy as a payload as the Falcon 9 actually can carry to low Earth orbit, to a very low orbit, just a few hundred miles above the Earth. So counterintuitively, in a way, the Falcon Heavy has not carried any supermassive payloads of this class, 17.6 metric tons. If you look closely in this image on the lower left, you can actually make out a stack of the older version 1.5 satellites in the clean room at SpaceX's payload processing facility here at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, so you get an idea of the difference in design and the size of the Starlink version 1.5 platform, which has been launching for a few years now, and the new version 2 Mini. Of course, the version 2 Mini, as I mentioned a couple of times, is a bit of a misnomer in name. It's much larger than the older satellites, but is just a miniature version, a smaller version of the full-size version 2 satellite for Starlink that SpaceX plans to launch on their new Starship mega rocket. That's a very large launch vehicle that will be carrying much more capable, much heavier satellites for the Starlink network, including satellites that are designed to link up directly to consumer cell phones. So that'll be a new innovation for this network. I mentioned these thrusters on the Starlink satellites. Each of them have argon-fueled Hall thrusters. These are electric engines, very low thrust but very high energy or high efficiency engines. Here's a look at what one of those engines looks like firing during a ground test with that distinctive blue exhaust. And on the ground terminal side, we've talked a lot about the satellites, but here's a look at what a user antenna looks like for the Starlink network. So if you sign up for the Starlink service, you'll get one of these antennas. It's a phased array antenna that points to the sky and can track satellites, receive signals, and transmit signals to and from the satellites as they fly overhead in low Earth orbit. SpaceX's countdown is now 27 minutes and 30 seconds from liftoff. Everything proceeding right on schedule for this updated launch time. We're now about an hour and a half behind schedule from the original target launch time, but for this updated time, countdown is proceeding on track. We expect to see, in fact, if you look closely around the Falcon 9 first stage right now, you may notice some of the vapors and condensation building up and accumulating around the airframe of the first stage, around the cylindrical structure there. That is associated with the loading of the cryogenic liquid oxygen, which is very cold. It's chilled down to a temperature of a few hundred degrees below zero. And when that is loaded into the vehicle, you get frost and ice build up on the skin of the rocket, on the outer skin of the rocket. And as that tank is filled, the liquid oxygen tank is filled, you can watch and track that frost line go up the length of that rocket until the tank is full. Below that, at the very bottom of the rocket, is the kerosene tank. You won't see any frost or ice accumulate there because the kerosene that's loaded into the rocket is stored much closer to room temperature, so you don't get that effect that you see with cryogenic propellant. 26 minutes, 15 seconds until launch of SpaceX's Starlink 6-3 mission. If you haven't done so yet, one more appeal to please hit the thumbs up or the like button here on our YouTube stream. That helps us attract a larger audience for our coverage as we're now well into propellant loading and well into the automated countdown sequence, now 26 minutes from liftoff. Also, if you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button. You'll get alerts every time we're going live with our launch coverage. The condensation and frost is becoming more visible now as we're now 10 minutes into the propellant loading timeline. This will be the 24th orbital launch attempt of the year from here on Florida Space Coast. This includes launches from pads at Kennedy Space Center and from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This chart shows the rising trend in launch cadence over the last few years, peaking last year with 57 launches, space launches from Florida Space Coast, driven largely by SpaceX. In fact, of the 23 launches so far this year, 22 of those have been with SpaceX. One was the test flight of Relativity Space's Terran 1 rocket. That was a 3D printed launch vehicle that performed test flight back in March on an orbital launch attempt, but the rocket failed to reach orbit on that test flight, although Relativity chalked it up as largely a success based on the lessons they learned. There was no customer payload on board. It was purely a test flight. But that was an orbital launch attempt. So that comes to 23 in total. Tonight is number 24 of the year. So launch companies, primarily SpaceX, again, on pace to match or potentially exceed the number of launches we saw last year. Here's a look at the SpaceX countdown timeline. We've already passed a couple of these milestones with the launch director poll at T-minus 38 minutes, and then the start of propellant loading at 35 minutes prior to liftoff. At the same time, the ground computer, the computer that oversees the countdown, took control of the steps and all the procedures that need to be completed to configure the Falcon 9 for liftoff. Coming up in about 3 minutes, we expect to see the so-called big vent from the strongback. That's the structure just to the right of the rocket that you see out on pad 40. This big vent will be a plume of gaseous oxygen that will suddenly appear from the strongback about 2/3 of the way up the vehicle. That will be an indication that chill down or thermal conditioning is underway to prepare for loading of the super cold liquid oxygen into the second stage, which is due to begin at T-minus 16 minutes. And then in the final 10 minutes, the activity really picks up at T-minus 7 minutes. The thermal conditioning or chill down of the Falcon 9's 9 first stage engines will get underway. This is a step to help prevent damage to those engines from thermal shock as the super cold oxidizer flows into that engine compartment during the ignition sequence. And then at T-minus 4 minutes 30 seconds, the strongback will begin retracting to an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the rocket. All during this time as well, we expect to hear calls from SpaceX Launch Control that the kerosene loading is complete on the first stage. So at that point, the fuel will be fully loaded onto the vehicle. And then at 2 minutes prior to launch, liquid oxygen will be fully loaded, and that liquid oxygen loading will be terminated. And at that point, SpaceX will have a 1.2 million pound rocket ready for liftoff. And then at 1 minute in the countdown, The control of the countdown will be handed over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's flight computer, which will run through a series of numerous pre-launch checks to make sure all parameters are within limits. At 45 seconds, the SpaceX launch director will verify their go for launch. And then also in this final minute of the countdown, the tanks, Falcon 9 propellant tanks, will be brought up to flight pressure. And then at T-minus 3 seconds, we'll see the engine startup sequence begin. And if everything looks good with those engines, at T0, when the clock strikes 0, the 4 hydraulic hold-down clamps at the very bottom of the rocket that connect the base of the booster to the reaction frame and the strong back and that transporter system, all those will open simultaneously, allowing the Falcon 9 to begin its climb into space. We're now 20 minutes, 45 seconds from launch time. Next major event will be the big vent from the strong back in less than a minute's time. We may also hear a call shortly that the loading of RP1 kerosene is complete on stage 2. There's the big vent from the strong back out at pad 40. Everything looks good.
Stage 2 fuel load complete.
And SpaceX has confirmed that the second stage has been fully loaded with fuel. So kerosene, rocket-grade kerosene known as rocket propellant 1 has been fully loaded into the second stage. That's the first propellant tank to be filled. Kerosene continues flowing into the first stage. That'll continue for another 13, 14 minutes or so. Liquid oxygen continues flowing into the first stage rather, and will begin flowing into stage 2 in the next few minutes. Now 17 minutes, 40 seconds until liftoff. In the next minute or so, this big vent that you're seeing, this cloud of gaseous oxygen next to the rocket, that will be ended, and that cloud will dissipate, and we should hear a call around that time in about a minute or so that liquid oxygen loading is starting on stage 2. The Falcon 9 rocket is 229 feet tall, 70 meters in height. It's situated in between those 4 antenna-like towers. Those are lightning protection towers that protect the rocket from lightning strikes while it's vertical out on the pad. That big vent is now terminating.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
And liquid oxygen loading has started on stage 2. This is the final propellant tank to be loaded with propellant this morning as the countdown is approaching 16 minutes until liftoff. If you want to support our coverage, there are a couple of ways to do that. You can contribute in the super chat here on our YouTube stream. We appreciate those of you who have already done so, including Josh King a few minutes ago. Thank you for your contribution. So if you like what we do and want us to continue bringing you this live coverage from Cape Canaveral and continue our spaceflight coverage on spaceflightnow.com, our website, please contribute in the super chat. That goes toward helping us remain staffed, helping us with new technology, camera gear, computers, electronics, everything we need to bring you this live launch coverage. You help us obtain with your contributions. So the super chat's one way to do that. The other way is to become a member of our YouTube channel. You can do that by clicking the join button here on our YouTube stream. And if you do that, you'll see we have a number of membership tiers available for you to choose from. And depending on which level you select, you can gain access to bonus members-only video features. And again, you're helping us continue bringing you live coverage like this and helping us extend now 23 years of continuous coverage of spaceflight at our website, www.spaceflightnow.com. SpaceX's countdown now is inside of 15 minutes until liftoff. One more look at the Falcon 9 rocket and its major components. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is powered by 9 Merlin 1D engines. These engines burn kerosene and liquid oxygen. That's what's being loaded into the vehicle right now. And these engines will generate a combined thrust of 1.7 million pounds at full power. And these engines will also help guide the rocket toward its landing on a drone ship for recovery and reuse. 3 of these engines will relight for an entry burn to slow down for the plunge back through the atmosphere. Then the center engine of this 9-engine cluster will perform the final landing burn for a touchdown on the drone ship northeast of the Bahamas. This booster is going for its 5th flight to space this morning. Above the booster is the inner stage. This is a carbon structure with the 4 grid fins around the circumference to help provide stability and some steering authority during reentry and recovery of the booster. Inside that volume, it's a hollow volume. Inside that structure is the upper stage engine. This is a single Merlin vacuum engine or MVAC engine, a derivative of the 9 engines from the first stage. And the upper stage is the only major part of the rocket that's not reusable. It will perform 3 burns, 2 to place the Starlink satellites into their proper orbit, and then after those satellites separate, a final burn, a deorbit burn, to guide the booster, or the upper stage rather, back into the atmosphere for reentry south of South Africa, I believe is where the reentry is targeted for this mission. And that upper stage will be disposed of to ensure it doesn't create any unnecessary space debris. Above the upper stage is the payload fairing. Inside that shroud sits the 22 Starlink satellites stacked one on top of the other. The payload fairing by itself is about 43 feet tall, or 17 meters tall, and consists of 2 shells that will separate about 3 minutes into the mission and will actually be recovered as well after parachuting into the ocean. A SpaceX recovery boat will go over and pluck those from the sea and bring those back to the Cape Canaveral, for refurbishment and reuse. So there's the Falcon 9 rocket that's 12 minutes, 20 seconds away from liftoff on the Starlink 6-3 mission. This will be SpaceX's 33rd launch of the year, 32nd with the Falcon rocket family. The 33rd that we're counting is the Starship test flight last month from South Texas. This will be the 30th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket in 2023. Now 11 minutes, 30 seconds remaining until liftoff. Here's a look at the trajectory for this mission. It's heading off to the southeast, as most of SpaceX's Starlink missions of late have done. The red line here shows the path of the first stage that it will take from the launch pad at Space Launch Complex 40, which we've labeled here on Florida's East Coast. And the landing, the target, is a drone ship named a Shortfall of Gravitas, about 400 miles or about 640 kilometers downrange northeast of the Bahamas. That will take about 8.5 minutes for the Falcon 9 to cover that 400-mile distance. That upper stage of the Falcon 9 will separate from the booster about 2.5 minutes into the flight while the booster comes back to Earth. The upper stage will continue on into orbit. We've labeled that trajectory or ground track with the green line here, and it will perform actually a slight right-hand turn using its engine to vector thrust for a dogleg maneuver to ensure it doesn't directly fly over any of the Bahamas, any of the islands out there, to put any population at risk. And that dogleg maneuver will result in a target for a 43-degree inclination orbit. The rocket will fly north of the Turks and Caicos, east of Puerto Rico, and then out over the Caribbean on into orbit. We'll take a look at the launch timeline for this mission. As with many of the Starlink missions of late, it's pretty much a copy and paste for the times, just a few seconds difference between each mission. This mission will take about 1 hour and 5 minutes from liftoff until separation of the 22 Starlink satellites from the second stage. That will be when SpaceX's Falcon rocket team can declare success on the primary goal of this mission. It'll take about 2.5 minutes for the first stage to complete its job sending the satellites toward space, and the second stage will fire its engine for 6 minutes to reach a parking orbit. And around the same time as it reaches orbit, we should see the first stage landing on the drone ship, and then there's another very short burn by the upper stage, 54 minutes into the flight, to set the stage for the deployment of the 22 Starlink satellites 1 hour and 4 minutes and 56 seconds after liftoff. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 7 minutes. At that point, we expect to hear confirmation of the start of engine chill down on the first stage Merlin engines.
Start of engine chill.
And SpaceX has just confirmed the start of engine chill down. This is a procedure to flow just a little bit of super cold liquid oxygen, which is a few hundred degrees below zero, very cold, through the engine plumbing At the bottom of the first stage, this is a step to help prevent the risk of thermal shock or any damage to the sensitive hardware in that engine plumbing from the exposure to that super cold fluid. So they flow a little bit of that liquid oxygen through the engines at a very slow rate, small quantities, to help configure everything and make sure everything's at the right temperature for the more rapid flow of
Stage 1, fuel
oxidizer
load complete.
at engine ignition. And SpaceX has also just confirmed, as the countdown is at T-minus 6 minutes, that the first stage fuel load is complete. So the RP-1, or Rocket Propellant 1 kerosene tank on stage 1 is now full. We heard a confirmation a few minutes ago that the second stage was full of fuel. So the rocket is now fully fueled for liftoff, about 46,000 gallons of kerosene now on board. But liquid oxygen loading will continue down until about T-minus 2 minutes before that is terminated. So still a little bit more to go with liquid oxygen loading. Now 5 minutes, 30 seconds until liftoff. At this point in the countdown, the automated computer controlling this sequence is also running through checks of the autonomous flight termination system, the destruct system that would be used to destroy the rocket in the event of a major mishap or malfunction after liftoff. Also, final checks and configurations are underway on the navigation system on the Falcon 9. SpaceX's countdown is now approaching T-minus 5 minutes. The first stage booster on this mission is numbered Booster 1076 in SpaceX's fleet. It's flown 4 times before. It debuted back in November.
Tank suppressing for strong back retract.
With a cargo mission heading to the International Space Station, it launched a batch of OneWeb internet satellites from Cape Canaveral in January. It launched a batch of Starlink satellites in February. And then most recently, on April the 7th, a little more than a month ago, it launched the Intelsat 40E geostationary communications satellite, which also carried a NASA air quality sensor. So that was its most recent flight, now back on the pad, ready to go to space for the 5th time.
Strong back retract has started.
Retraction of the strong back is now beginning out at pad 40. You'll see that structure just to the right side of the launch vehicle recline ever so slightly over the next minute or so. Now T-minus 4 minutes until liftoff. The strong back is heading to a position just about 1.5 degrees from the vehicle. At liftoff, you'll see that structure recline in a much more rapid motion to clear out of the way for liftoff. Three minutes and 6 seconds remaining in the countdown. You can see that strong back is now retracted.
Stage 1, LOX load complete.
First stage liquid oxygen tank is now full. We should hear a similar call in less than a minute for liquid oxygen load completion on stage 2. Countdown right on schedule right now for 2:19 a.m. Eastern Time or 6:19 a.m. UTC liftoff from pad 40. Now 2 minutes and 30 seconds to go. Standing by for confirmation of liquid oxygen load completion on stage 2. 2 minutes until liftoff.
Stage 2, LOX load complete.
T-minus 90 seconds and counting. We just heard the call a few moments ago that stage 2 liquid oxygen loading is now finished. So SpaceX has a fully loaded
Ground gas closeouts.
1.2 million pound rocket on pad 40. At liftoff, the engines will generate 1.7 million pounds of thrust to propel that rocket off the pad. And at T-minus 60 seconds, in just a few moments, control of the countdown will be handed from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard computer to govern all those final checks before liftoff.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
And SpaceX confirms that handoff has occurred. Flight computer now in control. 40 seconds to liftoff. T-minus 30. Propellant tanks being brought to flight pressure now. Vent valves are being closed. T-minus 20. T-minus 10. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition of the Merlin engines and liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket. 22 more Starlink satellites on the way to orbit. "15 seconds into the flight, everything looking good. Falcon 9 now pitching downrange, heading to the southeast from Cape Canaveral. Let's listen to the Merlin engines. One minute into the flight, Falcon 9 now supersonic. See the contrail forming as the vehicle rockets into the stratosphere now. And the rocket has passed the point of max Q, that's maximum aerodynamic pressure. "90 seconds into the flight. Falcon 9 now at an altitude of about 30 kilometers. It's about 30,000 meters or more than 100,000 feet. 2 minutes into the flight. Now about 30 seconds until main engine cutoff. You'll see that plume grow darker in the next few moments as it heads into the rarefied upper atmosphere. And then we'll see the engine cutoff followed a moment later by staging and then ignition of the second stage engine. We'll switch over to SpaceX briefly for onboard camera view of stage separation. There's a main engine cutoff. And here's a SpaceX view, a few seconds delay in this feed from SpaceX. And there's stage separation. And we see an onboard view of the upper stage engine ignition. So the Merlin vacuum engine now firing for its first burn. This will last about 6 minutes to propel the 22 Starlink satellites into a parking orbit. See on the left-hand side of your screen, the grid fins deploying from the first stage booster. Those grid fins extending now to help guide the rocket during its descent. And there's separation of the payload fairing to expose those 22 satellites to the environment of space for the first time. Approaching T+4 minutes. We're still seeing a view from our camera at Kennedy Space Center showing the engine exhaust from the second stage still visible in the sky as it heads off to the southeast over the Atlantic Ocean. 4 minutes, 15 seconds into the flight. Switch back to SpaceX's onboard camera view. You can see that engine nozzle on the upper stage engine glowing red hot. This is normal as that hot exhaust exits the engine bell, producing about 200,000 pounds of thrust. SpaceX has just confirmed that the downrange tracking station in Bermuda is now receiving signals from the rocket as it heads farther away from Cape Canaveral. Still in view, though, from our camera at Kennedy Space Center. SpaceX's video feed does come with about an 8-second delay. It's just due to the latency of the internet feed that we're getting from SpaceX. 5 minutes into the mission, altitude of the upper stage and the Starlink satellites now approaching 150 kilometers, 11,600 kilometers per hour. First stage is now at 106 kilometers and descending. We're hearing reports now from SpaceX Launch Control that both vehicles remain on nominal trajectories, so they're right where they're expected to be as the upper stage accelerates into orbit and the first stage descends toward SpaceX's drone ship. Now about 30 seconds away from the next major event, which will be the entry burn on the first stage. So 3 of the engines on the first stage that we saw fire off the pad a few minutes ago, 3 of those engines will relight for about a 20-second burn to slow the velocity of the first stage as it descends deeper into the atmosphere. That entry burn now about 10 seconds away. We're now seeing the entry burn underway, and I think we're now seeing that also in our camera view from Kennedy Space Center. You see a glow on the horizon as the rocket descends over the horizon. And here's the view on board the Falcon 9. On the left-hand side, you can see that entry burn now complete. SpaceX confirms entry burn shutdown. The upper stage, meanwhile, continuing to fire into orbit. 160 kilometers altitude, approaching 16,800 kilometers per hour on the second stage. About a minute and a half remaining until first stage landing and also orbit insertion on stage 2. Those 2 events will occur just a few seconds apart. You can see the telemetry feed on the lower left. We're not seeing any live video, but the first stage now below 10 kilometers or 6 miles altitude. That's about 30,000 feet. And we've just heard the first stage is now subsonic. It has passed through the transonic regime and is now below the speed of sound. We hope to get another view from the first stage or the drone ship, one or the other, during the final descent and landing of the first stage. That's now about 30 seconds away.
Stage 2 landing burn. Guidance.
And the landing burn is underway. We're getting that live view from SpaceX. The left-hand side of the split screen is the first stage. The right side is the upper stage. See the engine firing. 1 of the 9 engines ignited now to slow the rocket for landing on the drone ship now coming into view.
Stage 1 landing
There's
confirmed.
Landing confirmed of the first stage. Booster number 1076 is back on Earth on the deck of the drone ship, a shortfall of gravitas floating in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of the Bahamas. This was this booster's 5th flight. It also marked the 192nd flight or 192nd landing of a Falcon 9 booster or Falcon Heavy booster. And was also the 118th consecutive successful Falcon booster landing in as many attempts in a row. So quite a record there by SpaceX. We've also just confirmed that the upper stage of the Falcon 9, which you see here, with its engine nozzle now dimming, that engine is shut down after arriving in parking orbit. You see here a view of the Starlink satellites stacked on the rocket in the blackness of space there.
Expected loss of signal Cape and Bermuda.
And the first stage on the deck of the drone ship, 9 minutes and 30 seconds since liftoff. So far, so good on SpaceX's 33rd launch of the year, 30th Falcon 9 launch of 2023. But the work's not over. The first stage will have to be brought back to Port Canaveral in the next couple of days. The first stage will be offloaded from the drone ship and then trucked over to a hangar at the Cape for refurbishment. But in the nearer term, the upper stage of the Falcon 9 will have to relight its engine in about 44 minutes time for a very short maneuver that will be the orbit circularization burn to reshape the booster's or upper stage's orbit to set the stage for separation of the 22 satellites, the Starlink's payloads on board, about an hour and 5 minutes into the mission. That will be at about 3:24 a.m. Eastern Time or 7:24 a.m. UTC for the final payload deployment when SpaceX can declare success for this Falcon 9 launch.
Nominal parking orbit.
And SpaceX has just confirmed that the upper stage did deliver the 22 satellites to their nominal or expected parking orbit, so that's a good sign. So they're right where they're needed to be, where they expected them to be. And the rocket will now coast halfway around the world before ending up over the Indian Ocean for this next burn of the upper stage. And then the satellites will actually be deployed over the Pacific, over the Western Pacific at 3:24 a.m. Eastern Time. This map from SpaceX shows the location of the first stage, which is now stationary on the drone ship northeast of the Bahamas, stage 2. Now coasting through space, flying over the Caribbean. Heading out southeast, it'll soon cross over the northeasternmost point of Brazil and then out over the South Atlantic. Now 12 minutes, 26 seconds into the mission. Here's a look at the target orbital parameters. This is the orbit that will be targeted after the completion of the next burn by the upper stage. So it's targeting a near circular orbit, 195 miles by 200 miles in altitude. That's 314 kilometers by 323 kilometers at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. The Starlink satellites are, the network is divided into multiple orbital shells. This particular mission will be targeting this shell at 43 degrees inclination. There are other orbits that are used in the network at higher inclination, including polar orbit, but this will be targeting 43 degrees. The Starlink satellites, after separation from the upper stage, will actually activate their onboard thrusters to raise their orbit to more than 300 miles altitude over the course of a number of weeks or months before entering operational service. Here's some mission stats for tonight's launch. This was the 224th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket, the single stick or Falcon 9 with one first stage booster. This was the 235th launch of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since back in 2006. That tally includes Falcon 1s, Falcon 9s, and Falcon Heavies. This was the 5th flight of this booster, 1076, 190th SpaceX launch from Florida, 125th SpaceX launch from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This is the most often used pad in SpaceX's ground infrastructure. SpaceX has 3 active launch pads for the Falcon rocket, 2 in Florida, 1 in California. This was the 180th launch from Pad 40 overall, including its previous life as the home of the Air Force's Titan rocket family. Some more stats. This was the 166th flight of a reused Falcon booster, 192nd landing of a Falcon booster overall, including Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy missions, the 118th consecutive successful Falcon booster landing in as many attempts. There have been a few missions that were intentionally expendable, where the rocket was not recovered intentionally. This was the 85th SpaceX launch, primarily dedicated to the Starlink network, the 33rd SpaceX launch of the year, and the 24th orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center in 2023. And once the mission is complete, a little less than an hour from now, if everything goes according to plan, this would mark the 201st consecutive successful mission by SpaceX's Falcon rocket family since 2016. Back to a full-size view of the map, you can see the upper stage with the 22 Starlink satellites now near the coast of French Guiana, soon to head over Brazil. We're going to sign off in a couple of minutes from our dedicated live launch commentary stream. We'll move over to our Launchpad live stream here on our Spaceflight Now channel for continuing coverage of the final few milestones. I'll be on there for a couple of updates as we head toward a payload deployment in about 50 minutes time. But before we sign off, I want to do what we always do at this point, which is to look ahead at the launch schedule. This is actually just the first of 2 Falcon 9 launches on SpaceX's plate today. In about 7 hours, less than 7 hours, SpaceX plans to launch another Falcon 9 from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. That launch is scheduled for 6:19 a.m. Pacific time, 9:19 a.m. Eastern time, or for those of you around the world, that's 13:19 UTC. This Falcon 9 will be launched from Vandenberg Space Force Base, northwest of Los Angeles, carrying a batch of 16 OneWeb satellites for OneWeb's internet network and 5 satellites for Iridium's voice and data relay constellation. So these are actually spare satellites for both of these companies, for OneWeb's internet service and Iridium's satellite phone and Internet of Things and asset tracking service. So on board 21 satellites in total, 16 from OneWeb and 5 from Iridium on this rideshare mission heading to polar orbit from California. And then back here at Kennedy Space Center, SpaceX plans to launch a crew of 4 to the International Space Station on Sunday afternoon, late afternoon, from Pad 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. Here's a live look at Pad 39A, where the Falcon 9 rocket for this upcoming crew mission is vertical, with the Crew Dragon Freedom spacecraft perched atop it. It rolled out yesterday to the pad from its hangar and will be undergoing a test firing tonight, Friday night, in advance of that Sunday evening launch with the Axiom Mission 2 to the International Space Station. This is carrying a commercial, all-private crew to the ISS, commanded by retired NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson. And then there are 2 Saudi astronauts on board with their rides funded by the Saudi government through Axiom, which has an agreement with SpaceX and NASA for this private crew mission to the ISS. Also on board is U.S. businessman and amateur race car driver John Schaffner, who paid his own way for his seat on the Crew Dragon spacecraft heading up to the space station for about an 8-day stay. And then later this month, on May the 23rd, next Tuesday evening, will be the next Falcon 9 launch from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So the pad that we saw used tonight will be turned around and readied for this next launch of the Badr 8 communications satellite, which is owned by the company Arabsat, which is based in Saudi Arabia. This Badr 8 satellite will be heading up to a perch in geostationary orbit on the Falcon 9 rocket. So interestingly, back-to-back missions with Saudi Arabian customers, 2 Saudi astronauts flying from the Cape to the space station on Sunday night, and then 2 nights later, potentially, a Saudi Arabian communications satellite on a different Falcon 9. And then wrapping up the launch schedule for next week, another flight to the International Space Station, a Soyuz rocket, is scheduled to launch on May the 24th from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan with a Progress resupply and refueling ship, an unpiloted cargo vessel heading to the ISS. So those are the launches over the next week or so that we'll be covering here at Spaceflight Now. We'll be streaming a couple of these on our YouTube channel. We'll be covering them all, though, on our website at www.spaceflightnow.com. So I'm going to sign off our dedicated live stream here on our YouTube channel right now. We're going to move over to Launchpad Live. I'll have a couple of updates there just to update you on how the progress of the flight is going, chiefly with the upcoming burn, the restart of the upper stage engine, and then payload deployment. I'll confirm those events there. So my name is Stephen Clark. I'm the editor of Spaceflight Now. Thank you for joining us this morning for the launch of the Starlink 6-3 mission. I want to thank Stephen Young, our publisher, my colleague, providing video production support and camera work at Kennedy Space Center this morning. So until next time, thank you for joining us. We'll be back actually Friday night in just less than 24 hours here on our YouTube channel for the test firing of the Axiom 2 rocket, the Falcon 9 heading that will be launching later this weekend to the ISS. And then we'll have a full broadcast for you on Sunday for the launch of this commercial astronaut crew from Kennedy Space Center. Till then, thanks for joining us once more, and we'll see you next time.